All right, everyone, welcome to National Park Service Presents. As you guys know by now, this is one of my favorite programs we run. It's an online series that runs every other Tuesday. We started in January, and this is our second to last one. The last one will be on April 26th, which will be in 2 weeks from now. The entire series covered a multitude of topics, and this one is a big favorite of mine. We're going to be going over Patriots of Color because Patriots Day is around the corner. Before we get into it, though, I do want to go over some things. We are recording, so you can watch this one again or previous ones from the season on our BPL YouTube page. The best way to honestly find them is to Google Boston Public Library YouTube, and you will see the playlist pop up. Went over captions. Oh, here we go. We are a wonderful community here in these presentations. Honestly, you guys give great questions and are just so interesting. So you can ask any of your questions you want during the presentation in the chat. So at the bottom of the screen, there's a little chat bubble. Notice the to form, okay? So if you're asking a question, we'll say, who do you want to send it to? Hosts and panelists are all the people that you'll be able to see on the screen, or you can send them to everyone. That will be everyone watching back at home. So if you don't see them, that's everyone. If you do see them, that's panelists and hosts. But like I said, don't be shy. Feel free to type away. Ranger Sean will be keeping track of all the chats and the questions. And at the end, he will pop up on the screen and ask them. All we ask is for you to just be respectful. That's all. And before you leave tonight, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. If you could fill that out, we would love to hear feedback. And without further babbling from me, we're going to welcome Ranger Eric as he introduces the wonderful Rangers who are going to be presenting Patriots of Color. Take it away, Eric. Woo!
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, my name is Eric Hansen-Plass. I'm a park ranger with the National Parks of Boston, and I've had the pleasure of working with our two fantastic SE interns this year, our digital public history interns, and they're going to be presenting on Patriots of Color in the Revolutionary War, specifically the people that they've been researching and building stories for. But before we jumped into the stories that they've been able to put together, we wanted to talk about why, we call them Patriots of Color, and why we study them at all. And the reason why we study people of African and or indigenous ancestry who fought in the Revolution is, the obvious one is we want to understand all stories of the past to better understand our future, our present. To gain a fuller understanding of history, we need to tell all stories and understand them. But there's an even larger context and importance of understanding the stories of Patriots of Color. And that is, if you want to understand the abolition movement, every subsequent movement since the Revolution, arguing for other people's rights as citizens, other people's humanity, understanding how people saw those who fought in the Revolution is critical. The reason why we use the term Patriots of Color is it's a term used by the very first scholar, essentially, of this field, and that's William Cooper Nell. And William Cooper Nell was born and raised, educated in Boston. He's of color. He's of African descent. He's educated in the segregated schools of Smith School, but he becomes essentially the first historian for his community. And he researches essentially Black patriots who fought in the Revolution, not just because it was interesting, but because it was political ammunition to fight the institution of slavery. And by the 1850s, there's this rising notion that essentially people of color are not eligible for citizenship in this white republic. And in fact, a few years after he writes his book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, the Dred Scott case essentially says that there is no legal claim for people of color to have a right to citizenship. But if that's the case, Nell's pointing out that there are men who sacrificed their lives, who fought, bled, for the creation of this very nation. And this is the best quote that really kind of comes out of this legacy of his, and it's from his book. In considering the services of the colored patriots of the Revolution, we are to reflect upon them as far more magnanimous, because rendered to a nation which did not acknowledge them as citizens and equals, and in whose interests and prosperity they had less at stake. It was not for their own land they fought, not even for a land which had adopted them, but for a land which had enslaved them, and whose laws, even in freedom, oftener oppressed than protected. Bravery under such circumstances has a peculiar beauty and merit. Nell's work doesn't shy for what he's trying to accomplish. He's claiming that his ancestors, his neighbors, his predecessors fought and bled just as much. In fact, on a proportion, by percentage, even greater sacrifice in the war. They have just as much claim to this revolution as any white person did. How can you say they have no claim for citizenship? So it's this understanding of this community, this vision, this memory of Black patriots fighting in the revolution that's critical for understanding the arguments and the memory that's being formed in the abolition period, arguing for citizenship, arguing for the abolition of slavery. And so it's with this, we call it Patriots of Color, as an homage to Nell, his work, and the significance that the memory of these men, both known and unknown, played a critical role, not just in how we understand the revolution in its time period and how we understand ourselves today, but every subsequent movement since then. And so that's why we are working on expanding the research. We know of at least around 150 men that fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, for example, but who else came through Boston and had a role here in the revolution, who had an ancestry from Africa or of indigenous background? And so that's what we tackled. That's what we continue to tackle. And today, it's my pleasure to introduce first Danielle and the work she's done about Luther Jotham, and then followed by her, Angelica, who will be talking about Fortune Freeman and or Fortune Conant. So without further ado, Danielle.
Thank you. So the first Patriot of Color I'll be talking about tonight is named Luther Jotham. Born sometime around 1751, Luther Jotham grew up as a free Black man in Middleborough, Massachusetts. Now, we don't really know a lot about his early life or family, other than a younger brother named Calvin, who also served in the Revolutionary War. Next slide. What we do know is that at some point before the war, Jotham's family moved to Bridgewater, Massachusetts, where he joined the local Minuteman Company. These companies were emergency defense forces comprised purely of volunteers who trained to be ready at a minute's warning. There are two possible reasons why Jotham decided to become a Minuteman. One, Minutemen were paid for their service, so the salary likely appealed to him. And two, military service often led to a higher social standing. So for a man of color during that time, joining a military community would likely help him forge a more equal status with his white counterparts. Jotham's first call to action occurred on April 19, 1775, when an alarm broke out at Lexington and Concord. Jotham's unit did not march to Lexington or Concord to join the fight against the British Army. Instead, they marched to Marshfield, a closer location where British troops had been stationed. No fighting actually broke out at Marshfield, but by answering the alarm, Jotham demonstrated his willingness to defend his community. Next slide. After the events at Lexington and Concord, Boston became under siege. Colonial forces from various New England states assembled to contain the British Army that occupied Boston. Jotham formally enlisted to serve in the siege of Boston in August 1775. He spent 5 months stationed in Roxbury, which is the highlighted area in the left of the map, where colonial forces built fortifications to contain the British. He completed his service at the end of the year, but re-enlisted in January 1776 to serve for another 4 months. He returned to Roxbury for most of that term, but moved over to Dorchester Heights, the area highlighted in the right, at the end of March. The Continental Army had successfully fortified Dorchester, finally forcing the British to evacuate Boston. Jotham's unit stood guard over the area to ensure that the British did not return, and he then was discharged in April. Next slide. After Dorchester Heights, Jotham re-enlisted for a third time. His unit traveled to New York, where he experienced his first major battle. He fought at Harlem Heights in Manhattan in September 1776, which led to an American victory. This battle is depicted in the image on the screen. And a month later, he fought at White Plains, which ended as a loss for the Americans. He was discharged at the end of 1776 and returned home to Massachusetts, but enlisted once again in October 1777. This final stint in the war took Jotham to Rhode Island, where he prepared for a mission to attack the British that occupied Newport. Unfortunately, that mission ultimately failed, and Jotham later returned home for good. But what's interesting about Jotham's military service is that he always served as a member of his local Bridgewater militia, rather than as a professional Continental Army soldier. Most Patriots of Color tended to serve long terms with the Continental Army that usually lasted 3 years, but Jotham only served a few months at a time. Now, it's possible that Jotham merely wanted to avoid the long-term commitment, but another possibility could be related to those who he served with. By serving in the militia, Jotham fought alongside fellow soldiers from Bridgewater. We don't know for certain, but it is possible that a sense of loyalty to his community and his neighbors played a role in this decision. Next slide. When Jotham returned home to Bridgewater, he married his first wife, Mary, and they had 3 children together. In January 1779, Jotham made his first land purchase of about 15 acres for 320 pounds. With his newly purchased land came a change in status as well. In the first deed for his 1779 purchase, Jotham is listed as a laborer, implying that he made a living by working on other people's farms. However, all of the later records for his later purchases describe him as a yeoman, or a man who farmed his own land. This land ownership meant that Jotham no longer needed to depend on others for work. His newfound independence also gave him the ability to better take care of his family. Now, land records from that time period don't really provide addresses or street names. So even though I can't give an exact location of where Jotham's land was, we do believe that it was in this general area that's very close to the border between North Bridgewater and the neighboring town of Stoughton. Next slide. So living in a small town with a very small Black population did not come without its hardships. In November 1789, Jotham's family, along with dozens of other working class families living in Bridgewater, received warning out notifications from the town selectmen. The practice of warning out allowed New England towns to regulate those who might need financial support through the town's poor relief funds. So newcomers, paupers, and those who were unemployed often received notice of their ineligibility for financial support. What they need to do was prove their ability to financially support themselves in order to stay in town. These warning out notifications were not really formal eviction notices, but they often pressured people to leave town and settle elsewhere. Jotham being warned out is odd, considering his long-term residency in Bridgewater, his service as a Minuteman, and his land ownership. And what this sadly demonstrates is his inability to be seen as a member of the community that he bravely fought to defend during the war. Records show, however, that he likely proved his financial stability. He is listed in the census records for 1790 and 1800 for Bridgewater, so we know that he remained in town for another decade. Next slide. Now, in the early 1800s, Luther Jotham and his family moved to Vassalboro, Maine. And you can see his name highlighted on the town census record on the left. We don't really know his reasons for moving. It's possible he sought better opportunities over there. But according to historian Bradford Kingman, many other Black residents gradually left Bridgewater around this time. He purchased at least 20 acres of land in Vassalboro, so he likely continued working as a yeoman. Sadly, Jotham suffered great loss within his family while living in Maine. At some point, his first wife, Mary, and their 3 children died. He married his second wife, Reliance, in 1816, and they had 2 children, but the 3 of them also died at some point as well. Luther married his third wife, Rhoda, in December 1821, and they had at least 3 children. Next slide. Now, although Jotham continues to farm his own land in Maine, his ability to support himself and his family diminished over time. In 1818, the United States government passed a bill that provided a lifetime pension for all Revolutionary War veterans who needed financial assistance. A later amendment required that they list all their property and wages in their applications to prove their need. So even though this often helped their cases, the act of describing their poverty proved to be humiliating for many. Now, the list on this slide is what Jotham declared when he applied for his pension at the age of 69. It includes a small hut, a few tools, several animals. And regarding his yearly wages, Jotham stated, "My income does not exceed $5 a year. I am by occupation a laboring man, but from age and infirmity unable to do but little." Jotham's application was approved, and he finally received a pension of $8 per month as compensation for his service in the war he fought in over 40 years prior. Next slide. In August 1827, at the age of 76, Luther Jotham became a person non compos, meaning of unsound mind. An overseer of the poor in Vassalboro requested that Jotham be appointed a legal guardian under the claim that he could no longer take care of himself. Once approved, this guardian received the power to make all decisions concerning Luther Jotham and his property. Now, overseers of the poor can be considered precursors to social workers. They managed and distributed resources to those in need, including the poor, orphans, elderly, and people with disabilities. And while this usually meant providing small amounts of aid in the form of money or food or clothing, sometimes overseers sent people to live in poorhouses. These local officials also often belong to the middle or upper class, and so there have been some cases where they took advantage of those in need. Unfortunately, we don't really know the specific details of Luther Jotham's need for a legal guardian, but it is highly possible that his age was the main factor with this decision. Next slide. At some point after receiving a legal guardian, Luther and his family moved to China, which is located in Maine, just a few miles away from Vassalboro. He passed away in his home on June 1832, and at the age of 81, and he is buried in China. His story, however, does not end with his death. In 1860, almost 30 years after Luther Jotham's death, his third wife, Rhoda, applied for a widow's pension. She was 73, and she actually made some false claims in her application. For instance, she mentioned that Luther fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill, a claim we have since debunked after searching through military records. But despite this false claim, Rhoda's application demonstrates how Luther's legacy lasted well into the Civil War era, a time in which people of color actively worked to prove their patriotism and contributions to a country that denied them of their rights. And so, like many of his fellow soldiers, Luther Jotham attempted to build a better life for himself and the new nation that he helped fight for. His story is just one of many post-war experiences of ordinary soldiers who later struggled to support themselves, despite the valiant sacrifices they made while serving this country in its fight for liberty and democracy. I created a digital story map that follows Luther Jotham's journey, which you'll find in the chat, and I invite you all to explore it on your own time. But for now, I'll hand it over to Angelica, who will talk about a patriot of color whose journey differs greatly from Luther Jotham's.
Alrighty, thanks, Danielle. Tonight, I'm going to talk about a man named Fortune Freeman, who, in the spring of 1818, as an old man, applied for a veteran's pension, swearing that he had served as a soldier in the Revolution and was in need of some government assistance. Now, aside from his own declarations, few records of his life exist before or after the war. Only one of those records remained in his possession when he approached the court, a discharge paper from the 4th Massachusetts Regiment issued to him at the close of the Revolutionary War in 1783. Born sometime between 1747 and 1760, and originally from Massachusetts, Freeman moved to New York City at some point after the war. Old, destitute, and with little else to rely upon, Freeman sought financial assistance from the country he said he served for nearly 6 long years. Next slide, please. So in his pension application, Freeman claimed to have first enlisted in Boston in 1776 in Captain Elijah Danforth's company, Colonel Thomas Nixon's regiment. He stated that he continued to serve in the same regiment until his honorable discharge in 1783. However, when looking through muster rolls, there is no record of a Fortune Freeman enlisting in 1776 in Danforth's company. In fact, there was no record of a Fortune Freeman in Danforth's company at all. Furthermore, when Fortune Freeman presented his discharge, it was from the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. But Danforth's company served in what later became numbered the 6th Massachusetts. We continued to look through muster rolls trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. And we did find a Fortune Conant who enlisted in Elijah Danforth's company in 1777. Later records did show a Fortune Freeman who enlisted in 1781 into the 4th Massachusetts, serving until his discharge in 1783. But it's curious that of all the details to remember from 6 years of military service, the name that remained etched into Fortune Freeman's memory, Danforth and Nixon, show no records of him. So is it possible that these two different identities tell the same story? What I am sharing tonight are 2 stories presented as part of a possible whole. One of a man named Fortune Conant, who served for 3 years, from 1777 to 1780, and he disappeared after his discharge. And another about a man named Fortune Freeman, who claimed to have served the entirety of the war, struggled to live a life in New York City, and ultimately died in poverty. These stories, whether of the same man or not, are examples of how little information exists about soldiers, particularly those of color, who played a critical role in the founding of the United States. Next slide. So first, let's follow the story of Fortune Conant. Though Freeman reveals nothing of his life pre-war in his pension record, Fortune Conant is credited to Billerica, Massachusetts. Now, the Conant family name turns up throughout the history of Massachusetts, and though a few probate records indicate some Conant family members enslaved people, Fortune's name does not appear in any of those surviving records, nor does he appear in any land records throughout Massachusetts. So without finding his name anywhere other than the muster rolls, we're left with questions about his early life. But he does first appear in military records in May 1777, where he is listed as joining Elijah Danforth's company. Later muster rolls state that he officially enlisted in the Continental Army a few weeks later on June 4th, 1777. Next slide. Now in his pension application, Fortune Freeman asserted his presence at several well-known and significant battles during the Revolutionary War. But his assertions complicate understanding if Fortune Freeman and Fortune Conant were the same person. Now, Fortune Freeman recalled that he participated in the September 1777 Battle of Brandywine near Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, where he claimed to have been wounded in the thigh by a musket ball. But he also said that he witnessed the surrender of General John Burgoyne following combat at the Battle of Saratoga, which took place in October 1777 in upstate New York. That surrender is depicted in the painting on screen. Now, it is highly unlikely that Freeman saw action at both battles. They took place hundreds of miles apart, and they were only a few weeks separated them. And especially if he was injured, it's highly unlikely he could have made the journey from Pennsylvania to New York in such a short amount of time. And additionally, no recorded Massachusetts regiments participated at Brandywine. If he served as part of Nixon's regiment, like he claimed he did, it is much more likely that he fought in Saratoga. According to the surviving records, Fortune Conant, who served with Nixon's regiment in the late summer and fall of 1777, would have been at Saratoga with Nixon's men. So he would have seen General John Burgoyne's surrender. So if Conant and Freeman are the same, Freeman did serve at Saratoga and was present for Burgoyne's surrender. Next slide, please. Though we do not know Freeman's exact journey, he claimed to have fought next in the June 1778 Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. However, there is no record of Nixon's regiment at the Battle of Monmouth. Following this battle, though, General George Washington established a camp at White Plains, just north of New York City. And again, though no Fortune Freeman is listed with Nixon's men, Fortune Conant is documented on record at White Plains in September of 1778. If Freeman is Conant once again, and he settled at that camp in White Plains, he would have camped there with men who had fought at Monmouth. So he would have heard conversations about the battle. Perhaps in his old age, he believed he fought alongside those men. But according to military records, Conant stayed with his company in Nixon's regiment throughout 1779, moving to various positions to keep British forces contained within New York City. And he appears on muster rolls throughout 1780. On one muster roll, Conant is listed as on command on the lines. This possibly means that Conant served on a mission outside of camp, meaning that he got more experience in skirmishes around outside of bigger battles. Next slide, please. We also found a bounty note issued by the state of Massachusetts Bay on January 1st, 1780 for Fortune Conant, which you can see here. Now, discharged on June 4th, 1780, Fortune Conant does not appear in any further military records. In his pension, Fortune Freeman stated that he was discharged in 1780, which does line up with Conant's discharge here. Freeman then says he reenlisted in Boston in 1780 into the same company and regiment, Danforth and Nixon, but there's no record of any Fortune Freeman or Conant that served in Nixon's regiment after June 4th, 1780. But when Fortune Freeman applied for his pension, like I mentioned earlier, he included that sheet of paper that confirmed his discharge in 1783 from the 4th Massachusetts, which does have a record of the man with his name. So with that, we went and started to follow Fortune Freeman's paper trail through the military records. Next slide, please. That Fortune Freeman enlisted in March 1781 in Hingham, Massachusetts. So a question is, why Hingham? If Fortune Freeman is Fortune Conant, it is possible that he returned to Boston after his first discharge. When he returned to Massachusetts, he may have been able to finally claim freedom for himself if he had been previously enslaved. Perhaps he even used some of his bounty money from his first term of service. Upon returning to his home state, he may have moved to Hingham to try and start a new life, as maritime towns had generally more job opportunities than farming towns. But perhaps there, he encountered difficulties with work. When Fortune Freeman enlisted in 1781, it brought the guarantee of pay, which you can see here on the screen. If he did have bounty bonds from prior service, they would not mature until 1785, so he may have needed more money, and rejoining would have meant that he would have been able to get paid, and hopefully after that, eventually start over again. Next slide, please. By June 1781, Fortune Freeman arrived in West Point, New York. If Freeman served earlier in the war as Fortune Conant, he would have already been familiar with the New York terrain. In the fall of 71, Freeman is listed as on command with a Colonel Alexander Scammell, who led a New Hampshire regiment. In that same year, Washington had ordered the formation of a light infantry regiment commanded by Alexander Scammell. This regiment was composed of men from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and it marched south to Yorktown, engaging in skirmishes along the way. It served as part of the 2nd Brigade of the Light Infantry Division during the siege of Yorktown. If Freeman was Conant, it would have made sense if he had previously served on command and had been known or knew how to fight for him to serve on this light infantry unit. You can see his name highlighted here where it says on command with Colonel Scammell on the screen. And in his pension, Freeman explicitly mentions the capture of Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis and his army after the siege of Yorktown. If Freeman is the same man, he undoubtedly fought at Yorktown. That's 100% true. By November, he transferred from his command post back to his original company, and there he appears on muster rolls for York Huts, an encampment in New Jersey, from November 1781 to January 1782. But his paper trail then goes blank until 1783, and he doesn't mention anything else in his pension between those years. Next slide, please. On December 31st, 1783, Freeman received his honorable discharge from the 4th Massachusetts Regiment. Here, it is likely that Freeman decided to stay in New York after his discharge, as that is where he applied for his pension in 1818. If he declared or received his freedom during the war, he most likely did not have a home of his own to return to, especially if he had trouble finding a job before. So far, we have been unable to locate any land records indicating where Freeman might have settled after the war. It is also unknown what work he pursued. The only definitive information about Freeman's post-war life is that he resided in New York City by 1818. Aged and infirm, he could no longer work and support himself. By 1820, Congress had amended the 1818 Pension Act. In 1820, they then required all claimants to submit documentation of their poverty to the Court of Record. Following this, Freeman reapplied. While his wartime declarations remained the same, he provided additional personal information, his restatement, per the requirements, and described his dire circumstances. Next slide, please. In his restatement, Freeman swore to his inability to work and his need for government assistance to survive, as well as a sparse list of apparel described in the records as all old and nearly worn out, which you can see on the screen. He has a coat, 2 shirts, a pair of shoes. He doesn't include any other details except for his clothing. He also said that he had no family, aside from an 18-year-old daughter named Mary. She was described as bound out to service. We don't know if Freeman was married before, or what happened to Mary's mother, or why Mary was bound out or to whom. Poor families at the time could turn to the overseers of the poor for relief, like Danielle had mentioned. And some of the overseers could then place children in indentureships or apprenticeships. So it's possible that Freeman and his daughter turned to the overseers prior to the Pension Act. But there is no mention of Mary before 1820 to be certain that she lived with him at the time. By providing evidence of his need, though, Freeman continued to receive his pension. Payment records indicate payment through September 1824, but then they end with no explanation. Freeman may have died in September, possibly between the ages of 64 and 77. And the wide range there is that in his 2 pension statements, his ages, he de-ages from 1818 to 1820. So it's very unclear how old he was, whether he knew it or not, or remembered his age. So it has a big span. But it's possible that he lost contact with the pension program by moving, whether of his own volition or forced by outside circumstances. His cause of death or later whereabouts remain unknown. But despite the questions surrounding Freeman's life, it is certain that he dedicated years of his life in the fight for a new nation. Freeman's story is just one of the thousands of patriots of color that we can attempt to unravel by searching existing pension records, though thousands more did not get recorded. Some enslaved men found freedom in fighting. Others, born free, joined and fought for home and country and a hope to get any financial footing in life. The records only give us part of someone's life, and sometimes those records are misremembered or forgotten or incomplete. And sometimes the paper trail ends without any conclusive findings. But the stories of these men are important to tell when we look back at our nation's founding to see who served in the war that secured the independence for the United States. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it back to Danielle as well.
All right, so the final patriot of color that we'll be talking about tonight is Primus Hall. His story differs from both Luther Jotham and Fortune Freeman because Primus Hall became a very prominent figure in his community on Beacon Hill after serving in the war. Primus Hall was born in 1756 in Boston. His father was Prince Hall, the founder of the first Black Masonic Lodge, and his mother Delia worked as the servant of a Mr. David Walker. She lived in his home in Boston, where Primus was born. At 1 month old, Primus was given away to a shoemaker named Ezra Trask. Now, during this time, enslavers often gave away enslaved Black children so that they would not have to provide for them. One historian, Jeremy Belknap, wrote that Black children were reckoned an encumbrance in families, and when weaned, were given away like puppies. Next slide, please. Now, in some cases, arrangements would be made so that the children who were given away would learn a trade or work as servants in their new household. For Primus, the agreement was that he would be raised in the town of Danvers, located in Essex County, and learn the shoemaking trade while living with Ezra Trask. Even though both of Primus Hall's parents were enslaved at the time of his birth, Primus never considered himself enslaved. In fact, he later referred to himself as the adopted son and apprentice of Trask. He even used Trask as his surname when he served during the war, as you can see in the document on the left. Now, Primus Hall's personal view regarding his freedom status is somewhat interesting. Historian Jared Ross Hardesty has a book titled Unfreedom: Slavery and Dependence in 18th Century Boston. And in it, he argues that colonial era slavery should be understood as part of a continuum of unfreedom. In Boston, African slavery existed alongside many other forms of oppression, including indentured servitude, apprenticeship, pauper apprenticeship, and Indian slavery. So if we look at Primus Hall within this framework, as an apprentice, Primus would still be considered a dependent of Ezra Trask, and therefore not entirely free. But it does seem as though Trask gave Primus more liberties than others might have at that time. For example, Primus later said that he did not do well in the shoemaking trade and he didn't really enjoy it. So Trask gave him the opportunity to explore other work. Primus worked as a farmer and wagon driver in Salem before enlisting in the war. Next slide. Primus Hall first enlisted to serve in January 1776, towards the last stretch of the Siege of Boston. He signed up for a 1-year term and spent time stationed in Winter Hill, which is in present-day Somerville. And after the British evacuated Boston, Primus moved on to New York with his unit. For the remainder of 1776, Primus traveled around New York and fought at both Harlem Heights and White Plains, like Luther Jotham. So it's pretty interesting to think about how these men could have crossed paths on their very different journeys. Primus also made his way to New Jersey and participated in battles at Trenton and Princeton. He fought in the Battle of Saratoga in fall 1777, where he witnessed the death of his captain. As he later recollected, he was standing near his captain when he received his mortal wound and caught him in his arms to prevent his falling. But on observing that he bled profusely, set him down against a tree when he expired immediately. Primus Hall continued to travel along the eastern seaboard throughout the war, and in 1781 was appointed as steward to Colonel Timothy Pickering, the quartermaster general. In this role, Hall witnessed the British Army surrender at Yorktown, which is pictured here on the slide. And after being discharged in 1782, he returned to Boston, where he developed an important leadership role and became known for his community activism, which Angelica will now discuss.
So at some point after the war, Hall began work as a soap boiler. And as a soap boiler, he accumulated real and personal property worth over $6,000. He therefore had the means to purchase land in Beacon Hill, which he did, firmly establishing himself in the neighborhood, owning multiple tracts of land and selling a bunch to different people, sharing buildings throughout the years. In this time, he married 3 different times, and he had at least 6 children, but all of his children died by 1850. According to historian, can you change the slide, please? Thanks. According to historian James Oliver Horton, Black children in Boston rarely attended public school before 1800, and those who did suffered from discrimination, mistreatment, and public ridicule from white students and teachers. In 1781, Prince Hall, Primus Hall, and other prominent Black leaders unsuccessfully petitioned the city to establish a separate school for Black children. But upon their rejection, the group decided to establish a school themselves. The privately funded African school finally started classes in 1798 in the basement of Primus Hall's Beacon Hill home. A white school teacher initially taught the students until qualified Black instructors could be found, as described by historic documents at the time. The school later moved to a carpenter shop on Belknap Joyce Street in 1803, and then the basement of the African Meeting House a few years later. The school became publicly funded in 1820. Here on the right, you can see a picture of the African Meeting House now. Aside from education for students in this neighborhood, Primus Hall was very active regarding the end of slave trade, and his activism continued over the next few decades. Part of that was in 1788, 3 freemen of color, one of whom belonged to the African Lodge, were kidnapped and taken elsewhere to be sold. Enraged by this unjust and inhumane act, Prince Hall, Primus Hall, and about 20 other men wrote and signed a petition to the Massachusetts legislature. Primus continued to serve in committees throughout these years, building up support for abolitionism. And in 1832, he served on a committee at the African Meeting House that featured famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison as a guest speaker. It's believed that Hall was a big supporter or generally agreed with Garrison's abolitionist movements. And throughout these years, Hall continued working to improve the lives of Black Bostonians. Next slide, please. Primus Hall died March 22nd, 1842, but his legacy continued to live on through his contributions to the Black community in Boston, largely in Beacon Hill. A small gated path off Phillips Street is now named Primus Avenue after Primus Hall. Primus Avenue was formerly known as Wilberforce Place, and Primus did own land along that road. In 1855, William Cooper Nell published his The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which quote you heard from earlier this evening. And in his book, he included anecdotes about Primus Hall's contributions to the war and his community. Some of those anecdotes depicted a personal relationship between General George Washington and Primus, and those stories were often shared amongst abolitionists of the era as proof of Primus's integrity and influence. Now, Primus's story varies significantly from both Luther Jotham and Fortune Freeman, Fortune Conant. But what it is another example of the post-war experiences of Patriots of Color during those years, in the first years in the new nation. Though our map is not yet done for Primus, so we cannot share it with you this evening, we are working towards publishing in the next few weeks so that others can see Primus's influence for themselves and follow his journey from Massachusetts and beyond. And with that, that concludes our presentation on these 3 men this evening.
All right. Thank you both, Danielle and Angelica. Judging by all the questions and comments that were coming in through the chat, that definitely really opened some eyes and shed some light on some stories that deserve to be told. So do have a lot of questions. Don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but I will get to as many as we can here. So to starting off with, I think a really simple one here. And I think you talked about this a little bit, but just to clarify for everyone, did Patriots of Color automatically gain their freedom if they serve? And can open it up to either one of you.
I'm pretty sure no. Most of the time, those who did serve were either serving as enslaved men who were maybe promised freedom. Some might have bought it themselves post-war. There was no promise or guarantee. Initially, enslaved men weren't even allowed to serve in Washington's army. There were very strict rules on who was allowed to enlist. I don't know if Eric has anything to add there, if he knows anything more, but there were definitely stipulations.
We go into I was typing in and answered another question. The David Walker coincidence, which is, it gave us pause too. We're like, what? Yeah, no, not the same person. Not related. It was about Washington and enlistment. Is that what it was in Patriots of Color?
Automatically becoming freed after fighting.
There's much more of a clear promise of that in British service, that if you serve, you will gain your freedom, which is quite the inducement. And the problem is you have to, there's a lot of reluctance to make that overt promise, especially at the continental level. I'm not aware of any official announcement to that effect. And again, there's a lot of concern about alienating Southern planters and the loss of their property. And so what you don't have any, as far as I know, any real explicit official codified reward of freedom. But there's definitely that implication, and it's all kind of negotiated kind of on an individual level. So an example of Fortune Connaught, it's possible he just agreed with his enslaver. If he was enslaved, I serve, bring back some money, I'll be set free. Or, again, it's that gradation of freedom. So every case is kind of this negotiated circumstance. And everyone has kind of their own unique story, which is both really fascinating, but also really complicated to make sense of as a historian.
Thank you. So did want to, kind of in the same vein as that, I know that I think all of you kind of just briefly touched upon George Washington, but someone wanted to know if you could kind of speak in a little bit more detail to Washington's reluctance to allow African American in the Continental Army. And, he kind of, his viewpoints changing a little bit, but if you could just kind of speak to that reluctance that he had. What was like some of that reluctance from Washington?
I mean, in 1775, when Washington first kind of arrived in Cambridge, he was amazed to find what he described as boys, deserters, and Negroes among the Massachusetts ranks when he first got to the city. And by November of that year, he ordered that neither Negroes, boys, unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the company are to be enlisted in the Continental Army. So he distinctly said no to any African Americans serving. But very, very quickly, they realized that there weren't enough men to serve the cause, and they were fearful that they'd need more. So then Washington improved the enlistment of free Blacks in December of that year. But then the Second Continental Congress kind of stipulated that only free Blacks who served at Cambridge could enlist. So Washington was facing some backlash from those who served in the Continental Congress. But continuing through the war, needing more men, by February 1776, all free Blacks were allowed to enlist. And then Massachusetts itself lifted restrictions on soldiers in January 1777, proclaiming that all male inhabitants of 16 years and upwards could fight. I don't know in the years following how it changed, but that's when at least more regiments started allowing Blacks to enlist in service.
Awesome, thank you. So we actually just had a question come in that actually speaks to a couple other questions that folks had, kind of on a similar vein. So wondering if you could speak to, first and foremost, your general research process, your methodology, like some of the sources that you explored, and then kind of in a similar vein to that is like almost like an addendum or part two. What kind of source materials that you came across that might have captured soldiers writing about who they were fighting alongside, journals, letters, etc. And wondering if in those letters is race raised as an issue or descriptor with like value, are comments, descriptors value neutral in terms of race? So are people talking about race in letters, and then also just the general kind of sources that you use to, kind of unearth some of these stories?
Yeah, so I would say the main source that we looked into were pension records, because we kind of figured if we read through a soldier's pension application, we could then try to basic timeline of their lives, possibly where they traveled to during the war. And then from there, we looked at different primary sources to try to fill in those gaps. You can see that Angelica had a bit of a tougher time than I did, but I was able to look through muster rolls to verify where Luther Jotham had served. And then from there to kind of figure out where he settled after the war, I looked into property records, census records, and then probate records to kind of create this narrative. In terms of more personal writings, I didn't really look into those. So I can't really speak to whether or not racial descriptors were used a lot in those. But with the primary sources that I looked into, I was able to confirm that Luther Jotham was a person of color due to those racial descriptors. So they'd sometimes vary. He'd be described as a Black man or a Negro or a colored person.
Yeah, and my sources were largely the same as Danielle's. I just used a few, trying to see if Fortune Conant was enslaved. I looked through wills and probate records for a lot of Conant family members, and did find records that they owned different family members, but none that they named, which made it difficult. And I think that was one of the more surprising things, when they're talking about people, they list them in their wills as like a Black man or a colored woman, but they don't have names, which is just, it significantly shows just how devalued these people were. But yeah, I mean, like Fortune himself couldn't write, so there's no like letters or anything. Everything that's in his record was what he said out loud, to the court. So we don't have any records from him or about them that we were able to encounter.
Awesome. Thank you. As someone who has, dove into some of this research, I know how painstaking it can be to go through all of these records and things. So being able to pull them together in a cohesive narrative is very impressive. So another question, and again, recognizing that you were focused on, specific people, but wondering if you came across or know of any records of Patriots of Color that took part in maritime activities during the war. And if you are aware of any, where might those sources be located? And again, recognizing you were looking at specific people, so if you didn't come across this, that's totally fine.
I think in some of our primary record or secondary sources, there was a few mention of maritime service. I'm trying to remember one of the books that I used that does discuss some of it. Let me see if I can find it. But because we were specifically looking at Boston and throughout, tended to focus less on maritime. But there are a few, I know, there's some pension records where people are listed as like serving on a ship. And you can find those in the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors volumes if you like search specific ships. And some of those folks will be described as colored or Black. And you can like search through that to see if you can find it. And I'll let you know if I can find this book.
I think that if I can chime in, the key is, particularly if you're looking at maritime, you're looking at privateers, and you're going to be looking at most likely state records for the most part. So Massachusetts, well, I can't say fields, but supports and empowers a number of privateers that sail out from Massachusetts. And there's a lot of maritime records in the same record sets as the muster rolls. And so like the soldiers and sailors, the Massachusetts soldiers and sailors of the Revolutionary War, that's basically a compilation of this massive index card catalog that's at the State Archives building at Columbia Point. And basically it's every mention of a single person in any kind of role, they show up and then they've been cataloged by this index card. And the beautiful thing in this digital age is that they've scanned all the microfilm of this. We were able to do a lot of microfilm research without having to physically go there. But you find the card catalog record, then you go to the actual original record by volume and page. So that's where you would look.
Awesome. Thank you all for that answer. Okay, so why don't we go, I think we have time right now for one final question. And again, I think it's one that you have touched upon a little bit, but just wanted to clarify, you know, I think Eric mentioned this a little bit, but were there enslaved men who were forced to fight during the American Revolution?
It is possible that an enslaver would force an enslaved person to fight on his behalf. I've heard stories about it, but I haven't really looked into specific people, but I think it is possible.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Apologies if we did not get to your question. Do want to make sure we get everyone out of here on time. You know, I think I can speak for everyone when I say thank you both to Danielle, Angelica, and also Eric for helping pull together, you know, this wonderful research and sharing it in a narrative to help us understand, you know, other individuals participating in the American Revolution and trying to paint a full story here. So, you know, thank you all, and I will turn it over to Karen to close us out.
Hello. I'm just in awe. I'm honestly in awe. It's so impressive, just the research and the detail that you go into. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you so much, Angelica, and Eric too. Sean, you did okay. No, I really truly appreciate all the hard work that all the National Park Rangers do. They're absolutely amazing. And they make my job the easiest job in the world. So thank you so much, and come back again on the 26th. It's our very last one of the season, and we will be discussing the descendants of Darby Vassal. Unless I said that wrong, and I can't wait to figure out how to say it on the right way. Oh, good. Yay, I did it right. Thank you again, and have a great evening.